The story began when the protagonist, Ugga, had just graduated from the Magic University with his best friend, Cross, who suggested they form a party instead of getting employed on a miserable salary. But Ugga feared that they would face many obstacles starting on their own. However, he agreed and believed in their potential because even though Cross hadn't realized this, he possessed a raw talent to become a hero. Ugga alone knew this, thanks to his ability known as the Goddess Eye, which enabled him to see anyone's destined job and the skills they'll gain in the future. With Ugga's approval, both boys ventured into the dungeons to defeat monsters, and after facing tons of defeat, Cross became more powerful. 6 years had passed, and they were venturing without rest, while strengthening their party with more talents. With each addition, Ugga's significance became less noticeable, even though it was thanks to his Goddess Eye and excellent training skills that the party grew to what it was. So one day, when Cross told him he would have to leave the party for them to attain greater heights, Ugga had already accepted that it was time for him to get yeeted. Cross organized a farewell party for him the next day, but later that night, Ugga packed his baggage, preparing to sneak out silently because he would be too embarrassed to attend a farewell party. He was intercepted by one of the team members, Tiana, who preferred Cross's meat over his, but still held a personal beef with him because he broke up with her first. In any case, she asked what his plans were, so he said he would start afresh and find a new party, but Tiana advised him not to continue adventuring. This was because his training skills were excellent, evidenced by their party's growth, but that was the peak for Ugga. Although Ugga felt he could try again, he realized Tiana was right because he wasn't getting any younger, and if he found another party, they would only kick him out like before, and this would be the repetitive cycle of his life. To appreciate all his efforts in the party, she gave him severance pay, which was a territory worth 2,500 units of land. She advised that adventuring wasn't the only life he could lead, and that he could become a lord of his own land instead. The next day, while Ugga was wondering what exactly he was to use the land for, 2 of his teammates came by, with the girl, Emma, gloating at the fact that he had finally been sacked, and calling him dead weight who had only lasted that long in the party, because Cross and Tiana were afraid to hurt him with the truth. The other member, Dari, stopped her from her endless rants, and Ugga was ready to set off. At the same time, his former party members also set off to the holy land of adventurers, named Zattelbelt. They successfully parted ways, but Ugga felt seasick and took a walk, which landed him in front of some dude who handed him a travel wellness necklace to cope with the seasickness. It turned out that the guy was just a cutthroat peddler named Garcia, so he instantly grabbed Ugga and used him as a mannequin to advertise his phony voodoo charms, since everyone knew that Ugga was from the famous hero's party. Garcia asked what Ugga was doing there, and Ugga claimed to be sightseeing, but knowing Ugga usually hung around with Tiana, he expected to see her somewhere on the ship. This forced Ugga to share that Tiana was now dating Cross, so Garcia started crying as he mourned the ruthless massacre of Ugga's aura. Ugga used his skill, the Goddess Eye, and saw that Garcia had top-notch trading skills, which would prove a great asset to him as the future lord of a territory. He consulted with Garcia and told him where he was headed, so Garcia led him to a place known as the Yellow Crane Tower. Ugga got there and rested for the night, but he was woken up by a smoking hot Missy, who confessed that she had shredded his V-card the previous night, and that cost him 50 million. That morning, Ugga boarded another boat but found Garcia there and gave him an earful for leading him into the den of vixens. Surprisingly, Garcia revealed that he was only testing Ugga because after hearing that he was dumped by his party, he felt Ugga was on a self-destructive spiral and that it would be a bad business decision to associate with him. However, Ugga cleared his doubts, so Garcia apologized for distrusting him. Later, Ugga discussed more about the territory over which he was supposed to be lord, hoping the trader was willing to work with him. But Garcia didn't answer him, and they journeyed in awkward silence. 3 days later, Ugga arrived at the port of the territory but only found it in shambles. He broke down crying after he was almost buried alive by debris, but to his utmost shock, Garcia appeared right beside him, asking if he needed a hand. Later, Ugga took a second look at the documents Tiana had given him, which showed that there were 7 villages in his territory, housing over 2,000 villagers. He wanted to see the place for himself, but they had been walking for 2 hours from the port and hadn't run into a single person. Just then, Garcia screamed as they had just been attacked by monstrous bees. It wasn't difficult for Ugga to get rid of the bees, using an intermediate-level fire spell named Curado. He also reassured Garcia that he wouldn't have to be scared of the bees for so long because of Ugga's training skill and blessed performance, which would help Garcia constantly gain double the experience Ugga did in proximity. After walking for what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at a rundown shed and were welcomed by an old lady who was only a cough away from kicking the bucket. They asked her to help them navigate their way to other parts of the territory, so she agreed to guide them. On the way up the mountain, she revealed that she was living out there alone because her family and villagers were all devoured by the great serpent. As a result, she had felt she had nothing to live for, so Ugga got curious about her job and discovered that her latent job was a star idol, although she looked the complete opposite of that. Some hours later, they were drenched but still kept moving. Ugga thought about how he was now a weak bottom feeder, dragging himself through the mud as opposed to living the glam life he had originally intended to live. Instead of being an expert adventurer, blowing through legendary-ranked monsters and gaining accolades with priests and all of that, here he was trying to be the lord of God knows where. However, he knew he had to grow through it eventually, so he braced himself, and soon they were at a cliff overlooking the territory belonging to him. He saw thousands of people living there and found some buff daddies building an embankment to curb the tumultuous river from overflowing. He found peace in seeing how the people reconciled with nature instead of contending with it, and could tell that the people living in that land were inseparable. Looking at the land made him feel like he was looking at a singular living, breathing entity, and it suddenly felt like he was home. Instantly, he used his goddess eye and said he would take over as lord of the land. Garcia couldn't believe he was willing to give up on adventuring, but Ugga saw the territory as a quest on its own that would make them strong enough to take on high-level quests. Garcia was skeptical because the humans in that village were just simple villagers, and it would be nearly impossible to trust them out on adventures. But Ugga told him to trust him and remember that his training skills were absolutely second to none. They encountered more bees later on, and Ugga planned to take over formally as the lord of the territory by making his way to the capital to get the deed signed over to him. He also remembered his friends because he planned his trip in 2 days and realized that his friends would have arrived at the holy land of adventurers before then. Coincidentally, the scene of the story switched to show them on the boat headed to their destination. On the boat, Tiana was lost in thought and wasn't even paying attention, even while Emma spoke to her. The girl told her to stop thinking about Ugga because he was dead weight, but Tiana told her that she understood that Ugga would have been incapable of keeping up with them, and she had already settled him with severance pay. However, it was still obvious that something was bugging Tiana. Just then, some simps teased them, and Emma couldn't stop feeling herself, feeling she was a 10 out of 10. But it turns out that they were actually talking to Tiana, so they even shooed Emma aside, treating her like a toddler. Soon, Derry stepped in on her behalf, stopped them from bullying her, and told her she was pretty, but he wasn't the guy she was hoping to hear that from. The ruckus attracted Cross, who, with Tiana, told the illiterates to get the heck out of their sight. Much later, the team arrived at the sacred land of Zahelbelt, and Cross was excited to begin that adventure, especially after thinking of Ugga. Upon their arrival, they were welcomed by tons of fans, who were especially excited to meet Cross and Darryl, causing Emma to be jealous and remain a hater. One interviewer asked why their party, named the Fantastic Five, was short of one member and if there was some trouble going on in their party. But Cross wasn't sure how to tell them that they were actually down 2 members. The people murmured, so Tiana stepped in on Cross's behalf, saying their last member, the combat wizard Mori, was away on a solo expedition and they would soon reassemble. That was a smart move from Tiana, because Mori was on everyone's lips since he was a genius and the youngest among them. In fact, he was the most popular and got a lot of attention from the media, but this didn't prevent the troubles that were waiting for them once he linked back up with them, especially since they would have to explain that they had fired Ugga. Emma wondered what Ugga was up to and hoped he was getting along with the people in his domain, and it seemed he had finally found a village after walking some more. He and Garcia planned to rest, But Garcia worried that the villagers would be upset seeing that they were strangers in their land. In no time, they were surrounded by an angry mob, all holding weapons and asking them to reveal their identities and where they were coming from. Seeing that they had been completely trapped, Ugga and Garcia almost passed out due to shock, but the villagers were only sweetly welcoming them and even offered them food if they were hungry. The chief appeared, and Ugga was glad that they would finally get to catch their breath from the creepy villagers. But the chief was even worse than his people, and said the boys would sleep in his bedroom. He treated them to a nice meal and made by his gorgeous hotshot wife. Ugga asked the chief what industry the village partook in, and he shared that they were woodcutters. Essentially, that village was the wood village of Kimura, with a rough estimate of about 150 people who weren't just chopping down trees, but going as far as manufacturing it and transporting it for massive profits. The chief affirmed that business was profitable and mostly boosted after the Great Serpent came and left their village. This was because the serpent had created so much damage, requiring a massive demand for wood and reconstruction, hence causing the village's economy to boom significantly. The village chief told them that his people were the kind of people who would quickly bounce back from any sort of hardship. Ugga used the goddess's eye on the village chief's wife and found that she was destined to be a trader, although her actual occupation was a ton of weird skills. The goddess eye could tell him someone's ideal job, but not the actual line of work the person was currently employed in, because seeing the person's current occupation required a high level of the status check skill, and that was way higher than Ugga could manage. This was why he couldn't tell what all the young people in the village were actually doing for a living. When they were surrounded earlier, he was looking for latent adventurer jobs, but out of over 10 people he checked, he only found 2 with adventurer jobs. One had a mage job and another was a martial artist. Before they retired for the night, Garcia told him he had the perfect set of abilities to be a lord of that territory because he could tell what job every single person was born for. He could simply put all his subjects in their ideal jobs, and in no time, the territory would flourish. He ignored Garcia's shallow and short-sighted way of thinking, and the next morning, they headed to the biggest village in his territory, known as Nakamura. The village chief offered to have a crew guide them to Nakamura and brought them into the hands of a lady named Chiyo, who was better off on OnlyFans than on a boat. The girl was actually the one Ugga had spotted with the martial artist job, so he felt confident being in her hands and watched her command men with ease. Thereafter, he noticed how flexible Chiyo was, dealing with anything without hesitation and just being so hot while she worked. He found out that Chiyo was the transport manager for the village, or the lumber-moving chief. She gave them some rice balls, even though they only wanted to eat her rice cakes. Much later, they arrived at the largest village in Tokumo, named Nakamura. They found no one on the road initially, but were soon lucky to encounter some neighborhood kids playing. Garcia turned out to be quite the creep around them, so the villagers shot their loved ones in the house. Chiyo explained that Nakamura was more withdrawn than Kimura village, and they kind of had stranger anxiety. Getting straight to business, he asked her whether it would be easy to take one of the villagers from Kimura and put them to work as a woodcutter in Nakamura. But she knew it wouldn't work so well, given the personalities of her boys back at home. Hearing that, Garcia then understood that splitting people up and apportioning them based on their destined jobs wouldn't work that easily. Ugga further explained just how difficult it was to assemble the strongest party in the world, because it all depended on people's willingness to work with others, and a party was even less complicated than a territory. Because if getting 5 or 10 people to cooperate was difficult, then 2,000 people was unimaginable. Now he realized that trying to split all the people into single units was a one-way road to failure because villages and industries would rely on the growth of the individual, so balance was critical. Hearing their chit-chat, Chiyo felt Ugga and Garcia weren't really feeling their hometown, but Ugga said he really loved the town of Tokumo and was already looking forward to living there. Chiyo excitedly offered to create a home for him, but really, he only wanted to create a home inside her. She parted ways and they began their journey to the capital, going through all sorts of hardships and camping for the night. The next day, they arrived at the port city of Sukahama, and Garcia stayed behind for some business while Ugga headed to the capital to get the deed signed over to him. On his way, he purchased a newspaper, but saw that it was written in Eastern writing that he couldn't understand. He tried finding a newspaper written in the global script, but not a single place had what he needed. Although he knew exactly where to find what he was seeking, it was in an adventurer's guild in the far eastern branch, near where his quests may take place. He visited the guild, but wasn't sure just how popular his expulsion from the hero's party was in the world of adventurers, and the last thing he wanted was a whole crowd making fun of him behind his back or even in front of him. When he walked in, he peeped around and was ushered in by the guild receptionist, who directed him to where he could take quests and meet clients. Finally, he got a magazine written in a language he could understand, and on the front page, he instantly saw his ex-party members had arrived in the holy city of adventurers. Ugga could not hide his jealousy and quickly shifted his attention to check market trends and all the things that mattered to his town building. He also checked out the Adventurer magazine, which ranked and analyzed adventurers every 2 months. His ex-party was now ranked 9th in the world, making this their first top 10 ranking, while Cross, as a hero, was ranked 13th worldwide. For the second time in a row, an adventurer and spicy mommy named Fantani was ranked number 1 worldwide. Just then, he was interrupted by a guy named Roy, who claimed to know him and had recognized him right away despite the glasses. Immediately, other adventurers noticed his presence, and all Ugga wanted to do was disappear. Roy was a former classmate at the Magic University and had such a horrible personality that his nickname was Royal Pain. Roy didn't spare Ugga and kept yapping about how he'd heard about him getting sacked from Cross's party, even though he felt it was better that way for Ugga because they were starting to leave him in the dust since he had been underperforming. However, lots of those negative statements from the other adventurers kept getting to Ugga, and he became frustrated because he didn't know how to respond. As he walked out, a baddie with legs towering over the Eiffel Tower walked in and was none other than the adventurer lady, Fantani, ranked number 1 in the whole world. Fantani was not recognized as the top adventurer for nothing because she had a sword ability that could split the earth in 2 and could bend lightning to her will. She was also the one who had achieved unparalleled levels of sword mastery and was regarded as the strongest woman in the world, so it was completely shocking that she recognized Ugga. Everyone was crazy about her, but she was only interested in knowing what a man like Ugga was doing there in the Far East. They hit it off just like that, and he said something about how she was fond of thoughty armor, which didn't seem to provide very much protection to her important parts. However, she flexed her muscles and boasted that her armor gave her the freedom to display those abs and all those curves. Meanwhile, Roy was offended and pissed at the fact that Ugga was stealing his chance to get close to the top adventurer. He was busy getting jealous when Fantani was acquainting herself with Ugga, but soon happy again when she asked about Ugga quitting Cross's party. However, it was ultimately shocking when the lady didn't mock Ugga for getting kicked out, but rather invited him to form a party with her. Roy immediately jumped between them both to remind Fantani that she was known as the famous lone wolf who would never party with anyone, let alone team up with a fool who was at rock bottom. However, Fantani said she had wanted to work for Ugga for some time and only went solo because there was never anyone else who caught her eye. She went on to add that Ugga underestimated himself more than a little because she considered him a prodigy after learning that he had mastered every field in existence up to the intermediate level. For this reason, she felt he still had untapped potential and made it clear that she was dead serious about forming a party with him. However, Ugga knew himself that he was going to end up being dead weight again, even though he would have fun, so he politely turned her down, saying he had another goal he was working toward. He knew he could party with Fantani on one hand, but his most important goal was to nurture his territory to the point where they could take on high-level quests. The adventurers could not believe this idiot's audacity to turn down an invitation from the #1 adventurer in the world. But Fantani accepted what he said and checked her ranking just for the fun of it. Later, Ugga boarded a train to the capital while thinking about how to become a lord before he could head over there. Later that night, Ugga arrived at the imperial capital, but it was pitch black out, and he had to locate the government office. Just then, a corporate baddie asked him to step aside and stared right through his soul. From her dressing alone, Ugga suspected she might be headed towards the government office, so he trailed her until she got there. At the office, he stated that he was there to have the deed to a territory signed over to him. The receptionist contacted her supervisor, and the counselor stepped out but still said he was unable to help. That guy called another supervisor, and another one called another, and so on they went, making Ugga realize that he was really moving high in the ranks. He started giving up when the director said the emperor, who would have done the signing, was not available, and he would have to restart the procedure for signing over the territorial rights. However, the cabinet minister coincidentally showed up right then, and Ugga was pleased to see the second most powerful man in the country appear right before him. The man himself recognized Ugga as the one who slew the great serpent and asked him to show up the next morning so they could take care of everything right away. Also, he invited Ugga to stay at the palace for a night and be entertained at his house. They eventually arrived at the grand and perfectly architectured imperial palace, and Ugga was served a meal large enough for 100 men to feast on while enjoying a great conversation with the minister, who shared some pointers regarding managing his territory. The minister informed Ugga that his only obligation would be to attend the yearly Congress meetings, and after observing that he was granted much freedom, he shared his desire to take on quests with his entire territory as a whole. The old man permitted him to do so, but said that any hint of a planned insurrection would yield to their immediate repression. Ugga said he had no intention of anything like that, and only wanted to strengthen his territory and its people so they could battle monsters. However, it was his first time, so he had communication issues and didn't understand the language exactly. The cabinet minister advised him to make use of bulletin boards because at least half the citizens would be able to read. Ugga could not read the Far Eastern script himself, but the cabinet minister suggested that instead of letting that hinder his administrative ability, he would have one of his secretaries escort him back to his territory. The next day, the deed to the territory changed from Ugga's former party to his personal possession, and the emperor granted him a bronze sword as proof of his position, which made him officially the lord of Tokumo territory. Before letting him go, the cabinet minister invited Ugga to his estate and introduced him to the lady he had earlier bumped into, who turned out to be one of his secretaries and was named Igarashi. She bowed and greeted him, and the cabinet minister told Ugga not to worry because Rashi was a brilliant girl, whom he would find useful. In reality, though, the cabinet minister was only trying to get Ugga laid. Also, he was informed that Igarashi was a native of his territory, so she could help with translations. The ride back home was in first class, and it was rather awkward because Rashi was pretty difficult to talk to. He tried making small talk, and it was rather suffocating, so he felt she absolutely hated the idea of working for him and probably also had stranger anxiety. He activated the goddess eye to check her training skill, but found to his utmost shock that her latent job was to be a wifey. Instantly, she leaned into him, asking if he needed anything, but the dude was just blushing because he knew for sure that he had finally escaped the lost lands of Virgin Doom. When he was reunited with Garcia, the guy was desperately trying to get her to blend in with them. But even for a happy chap like Garcia, it was nearly impossible to break through Rashi's defenses. He became frustrated, saying he couldn't handle ladies like Rashi, but just then they arrived at the port. Ugga initially wanted them to camp there, but Garcia said they couldn't do that with a woman. However, since Ugga knew that Rashi was a native of the town, he suggested that they stay at her parents' home. He noticed her mood change, so he instantly apologized, saying that she could forget all about that and they would just camp while she returned home, but she said she wouldn't take that answer. She told him there was no point in his camping in the territory he ruled over, because he was already lord of the land. For a more befitting accommodation, she suggested a shrine near Nakamura, and they had to climb 1,000,001 stairs to arrive at the shrine. Upon their arrival, they were welcomed by the priest, whose son joined them shortly after. But it seemed Rashi and the boy were familiar with each other because her countenance changed when he showed up. The boy teased her, saying she must have gotten demoted to have appeared there suddenly. But she retorted that she chose to be with the Lord Ugga of her own volition. She told him to change his hobo-inspired outfits and look like a human, but he said he had just returned from working on the embankment. Apparently, the boy Shuhei was leading the construction effort, so Ugga showered him with compliments for being so efficient at his age. Rashi didn't seem pleased that her relative was getting compliments, so she disclosed he was famous for throwing crayfish at others and had also beheaded one of the shrine's stone statues. However, he retorted by saying that she wet the bed until she was in 2nd grade, but this made her so upset that she started sweating and crying. Much later, they spoke over dinner, and Shuhei informed Ugga that he wasn't going to give him hope that the people of Tokumo town would live up to his expectations because no one cared about quests, and even if he ordered them, they would only do it if they had any motivation to try, which they didn't. However, Ugga on his own end shared that the first step in training would be to inspire the proper motivation. So he shared that his idea would be to drive their motivation to fight by pointing out a shared problem among all 7 villages. For example, the monsters inhabiting the western region of the territory. Because the monsters lived in the west, if everyone contributed to getting rid of the monsters, then people could move into the western region, giving rise to the opportunity for industry. Xiaohei shared that all the villagers were rank amateurs when it came to fighting, and as such, they may be improperly equipped or trained to defeat the monsters. But Rashi informed him that Ugga had a special talent for training and cultivating talent. Ugga himself said he would only need to train about 150 people of the over 2,000 villagers living there. By using the same training skills, he used to build up the hero's party. He also knew that not all of these people would want to participate in quests, so he found a way to make sure they wouldn't all be participating in quests around the clock, and would prioritize villages that weren't otherwise preoccupied. For example, people from Nakamura could do quests outside of the farming season, and when work slowed on the embankment, needing less lumber, then people from Kimura could participate in more quests. Precisely, he planned to pick out a specific number of people to work on quests full-time, while avoiding hurting the industries since they were the backbone of their territory, and were critical to building their strength long-term. He had many things to say and many more planned, but if that was going to succeed, he would need their help. First up was Rashi, who offered to learn to be of help, and then Garsai, and finally the priest and his son. Immediately, Ugga assigned Garcia to examine the local economy in the morning while telling the priest and his son to mediate with the people. As for Rashi, he asked her to draw some bulletin boards for him, and that was all the tasks assigned. They ended the day with a fun-filled evening, which reminded him of just how beautifully his journey had initially begun with his former party members. Meanwhile, Lady Fantani went around searching for her younger brother, who had been missing for 3 years. She was currently in the region of Tsukuhama, asking people if they had seen anyone who looked like him. But instead of helping her out, they were more excited to see their celebrity adventurer and even wanted her to sign autographs. However, Fantani wasn't upset because she had earlier run into Ugga and couldn't forget how he had told her he had another goal to work towards. This was memorable to her because swarms of people who made no sense to her would usually die to team up with her, but the only one she ever felt a pull towards left her out in the cold. Concerning her brother, cruel thoughts crossed her mind that the boy Yuri was probably dead, but she shrugged that off and decided to return to finishing quests so she could remain number 1, because that would make it easy for her brother to find her someday. For her quest, she teleported to a different continent known as the Great Woodland Region, where she was assigned to deal with a horde of giant trolls. These trolls were thrice the size of ordinary trolls, and a horde would surely be beyond what an ordinary adventurer could manage. It seemed Mori, the combat magician, had already gotten to them, and Fantani watched as the young lad swiftly dealt with them using his magical abilities. He kept going without stopping and eventually got exhausted, but taking a closer look at his eyes, Fantani instantly thought that he was her younger brother. Since she hadn't seen her younger brother in 3 years, she was convinced he had definitely grown a lot. Besides, Mori didn't even resemble her younger brother or share the same hair color with him. The boy asked her to identify herself, and when he found out that she was the number 1 ranked adventurer and that she had also come to help him, he surprisingly told her to back off because he was unwilling to share the loot. But just then, a giant troll quickly appeared behind him and almost grabbed him. Mori dodged it by a hair and was soon back on his feet after Fantani destroyed the beast. Despite this, the boy wasn't willing to rest until he was the number 1 adventurer, so he summoned the highest level of fire magic and consumed some of the trolls with it. Fantani warned him to put it out before he would cause himself to explode at such a range. He paid her no attention, and the result was a final explosion that created a crater in the ground and left Mari's unconscious body in Fantani's hands. She took him beside a spring and applied healing magic to his body, but the boy started squishing her abs and freaked out when he realized what he was unconsciously doing. He was blushing cherry red, but she told him that it was expected of young men like him and even offered to take off all that plot armor for him. Thereafter, he had his fill and said he would be heading off, but Fantani invited him to team up with her and form a party. However, Mori politely turned her down because he had a master waiting for him, whom he respected more than anyone. He told her that if she was still ranked #1 in the world, he was also going to be #1 himself someday, and they could go on adventures together if she wanted to. Back at Ugga's territory, all hands were on deck, and Rashi had just drawn up the bulletin boards he had asked her to. Shuhei's wife joined them and helped fetch him some bulk weapons and equipment that he had ordered to equip his planned squad of villagers with. However, there were so many weapons that there was barely enough room to store them in. So Rashi suggested that Ugga get his own mansion since he was the lord of their land after all. The priest offered to suggest some top-tier carpenters, and Ugga was already scared of the bill, so the priest advised him to offer a favor as payment instead of financial compensation. After that, the construction on his mansion began, and the workers remained fervent at their craft. He built his mansion to the south because it would be nice for him to get close to the west once the monsters were cleared away and the people started living there. The main building was still under construction, but the villagers had already created a detached building, which was pretty nice and spacious. In no time, Chiyo bounced in with her melons and then ambushed Ugga with those goodies he didn't ask for. She had brought some more wood in exchange for his wood, but was surprised to find out that he was the new lord who had requested her assistance on the bulletin board. Thereafter, he told her about his plan to get rid of the monsters and said he would like her help because she had massive potential as a martial artist. However, she immediately got shy and frantic, saying the only thing she knew how to do was move his brick, and she wasn't so great at handling monsters. She said she couldn't help him and had zero confidence, but he said he had an idea. He started by explaining that all training boiled down to demonstration, instruction, and practice in that order, and he had a training skill that allowed him to take care of that personally. That skill was known as possession, which was well known to be the skill shamans used to draw spirits into themselves and channel them. But that was a bit advanced for Ugga, and his own possession skill only permitted him to transfer his own soul into his training target. It was his ability to use any job's skills up to the intermediate level that held the trick. So if he hypothetically transferred his soul into the body of someone whose job was a martial artist, when he performed martial arts, that person would gain the physical experience of personally performing those techniques. And then he would let the person try to imitate his movements into their own and repeat until there was perfection. It was this same process that got his teammates, Tiana, Emma, and Mori, to learn their respective techniques with lightning speed, but they soon advanced beyond the level he had trained them, and his skill lost any purpose since he could only transfer an intermediate level of skill. Also, another drawback was the sheer number of restrictions on his possession skill. The first restriction was that he needed to be alone with the target in a quiet, clean, and open space, and then he needed their unwavering consent. But it was nearly impossible to get Chiyo's consent in the first place. So, he told her that he understood her reason for holding back, but even if she wasn't going to take him at his word, she should only believe in the land she grew up in because he believed that the land had the potential to be so much more than it currently was. He intended to put all his skills to work to ensure that the land realized its potential, so he bowed before her, beseeching her to give him a chance to train her. She giggled and bowed before him, saying she was pretty sure she would disappoint him but should be thrilled at the very least. With her consent being acquired, he then made her lie flat, and his spirit made her discover new parts of her body. He asked her to get up and try to move bit by bit, but it was pretty hard for him to do that in her body because the bodies of women were different from what he was used to, and those dumbbells on her torso were pretty difficult to work with. However, they got around it, and he made some pretty impressive martial arts moves and then told her to try doing it herself. In the end, they were done with all of it, and Ugga told her that she was just as fit as he had expected. He showed her some practice mannequins to practice with, and to his utmost shock, a single blow from her hand blasted them away. With tears in her eyes, she thanked him, and he patted her on the head while stating that with her current skill, she would be ready for combat in no time. Later that night, as he had dinner with the guys, Garcia pointed out that he smelled like he had the smell of a lady's perfume on his body. But of course, he couldn't state particularly what had gone down with Chiyo. The next day, Ugga asked Rashi if she had noticed her grandfather back home had hit on a new skill or magic, but she said she hadn't returned home and would not know. Her grandfather's job was also a creator, and Ugga had marked him a few days back with the fourth of his training skills, known as Receiver. Receiver was a skill that allowed for remote experience transference. He had used this skill for his teammates in such a manner that if some of them were unable to partake in the quest and get experience, once he had marked them with the Receiver skill, they would get experience even if they were miles away. For territory management, his Receiver skill would be critical because not everyone would be able to fight, but he could still mark those who had pivotal roles. The skill could mark up to 3 people at a time, so the 3 he was going for were Rashi's grandfather, Garcia, and Shuhei. As the old man Isao leveled up, he would learn creation magic and improve all their crop yields while strengthening their base for the future. He asked Isao if he had felt different lately, but the man said he felt the same, meaning Ugga would have to gain more experience before the effects would kick in. So far, Ugga had gathered 25 villagers who would serve as adventurers. He had support mages, healing mages, combat mages, vanguard fencers, archers, and 1 martial artist. For the archers, there were 2 known as Kayuko and Hyoju. Meanwhile, Chiyo, being a martial artist, had a bigger role to play beyond simply fighting, since she was also a wood transport specialist, meaning she would still take charge of cargo. The plan was to take on quests with a party numbering over 100 members, so they would need to move a lot of items, food, and spare equipment with everyone. And that was why Chiyo's lumber transporting experience would prove invaluable. It was now time for them to have some intensive training sessions in the Western Forest, so they headed there right after. However, on their first encounter with a monster, which was a fire-type frog, they were all panicked. However, Ugga swiftly dealt with it by throwing some darts at it, and the villagers claimed he was so awesome. By using his blessed performance, all 25 of the villagers gathered there would gain twice the experience he gained, and with a little more grinding, they would all be leveled significantly. He warned them not to engage a monster if they encountered one, but they insisted on fighting with their weapons. But after checking their status, Ugga saw that his vanguard swordsman had an attack power that could barely swat a fly, and only Chiyo had enough power to actually fight, while the others were too weak to engage monsters. He begged them to be a bit more patient because they could not fight monsters head-on, and then he resumed getting rid of the monsters. He missed having so much fun while fighting monsters, even though these monsters were only low-level at the time. By the time he had fought enough monsters, his adventurers had gained a sufficient amount of attack power and experience, and in no time, they had also joined in on the fun. His swordsman, Yamasaki, was quite impressive, and so were the archers who were inspired after seeing their comrade pull it off easily. Thereafter, the confidence, the morale of everyone were boosted, and by nightfall, Ugga said it was time for them to head back. However, the villagers said they could keep going and had only started having their own fun, but Ugga warned them that monsters only got more dangerous at night, and it wasn't worth returning to the woods. But just then, one of the villagers ran in with another who had just been attacked by a fire frog, but this time, a boss-level fire frog. It turned out that it was Yamasaki who got injured and was burned terribly, and that the power of the fire frog amplified because of nightfall and permitted a slime to be secreted from its back, which made it tougher. The villagers were almost defeated in thought and begged Ugga to rescue them, but he told them they could all take it out, and even though they didn't believe him, he was confident in what he said. He created a plan with them where they initially lured the fire frog into position while he and the support mages acted as the decoy. In that time, the archers would kick in and take out its eyes, and then from the trees, the mages would cast ice magic as he had taught them. Even though that wasn't sufficient damage to defeat the fire frog, it would trick the beast into believing that its enemies were above it, and it would thus show its belly. Now, the fire frogs couldn't secrete slime from their bellies, So it was at that time that the swordsmen and close-range attackers could then kick in and slice them from all angles. They eventually succeeded and celebrated their wins, including the teamwork that got them that far. Yamasaki apologized for being so selfish and thinking about himself, but Ugga told him that it was a lesson regardless, and together with his teammates, he would turn out just fine. With that, the adventurers gained sufficient attack power and were all geared to keep it going. They were approached by Isao, the old man, who told Ugga that he could now do incredible things. And this was all because the receiver Ugga placed on him transferred battle experience to him, making him level up. Isao displayed his production magic and showed that he could now grow a strand of hair on his bald head. But Rashi was embarrassed and had to drag her crazy old grandpa home. The next day, Ugga struggled to tame a horse he had been gifted by the chief of Nakamura. This horse would prove indispensable for navigating huge stretches of land, but King Cactus wasn't willing to listen to him, but easily obeyed Rashi when she patted him. Much later, as the season shifted in his territory to summer and left the rice planting season, he had trained 50 more people, bringing the number up to 75 in total. However, reorganizing 75 people was anything but simple, because he also had to beg them not to chop each other's heads off. Not to mention that his horse was high on mushrooms. Seeing that he was stressed out, Yamasaki and the others urged him to go take a rest because they had now become pro fighters and were dealing with these monsters like mosquitoes. Obviously, these first 25 adventurers were making huge strides, especially the support mages who had learned real spells. But the one who was the most impressive was Chiyo, whose fighting strength was as high as 10 times the previous amount. Later, he joined the western side of the territory with the old lady Natty. According to her, the territory had 3 mountains, and on the north side of 2 of those mountains was where his territory ended and the neighboring territory began. Unfortunately, on his own side, very little forestry grew and was unsuitable for crop production. But just then, Rashi spotted a cave and they got to the entrance. Ugga asked the old woman if she knew anything about it, but she said she only remembered her parents warning her not to get close to it because it could cave in. He insisted that they return that day and investigate it another day. Later, a guy named Bando came on behalf of the neighboring territory's lord. He was seeking Ugga and his adventurers' help in exterminating the great ape nesting in their territory, because word of the land of Tokumo's exploits had reached even Ugga. Garcia was excited for Ugga because that would be their very first expedition, so Ugga said he needed some time to think about it and would send a letter with his response. Garcia asked him why he hesitated, given that helping the land of Ugga would help them boost a friendly relationship and that the same city had been widely known for building ships. This would prove relevant for Ugga, who wanted to procure many ships for his own territory so they could register with the guild and take on many quests. So Garcia urged him to hurriedly take the quest and clear it before some other good adventurer parties would seize the opportunity from them. Even though Garcia was pretty confident in the team Ugga had raised, Ugga said that at their current pace, they would need half a year or more because a giant ape was a god-class monster, a high-ranking monster. But even the lesser apes with a height of 4 meters would still prove difficult, and Ugga didn't want to risk pushing his subordinates to get wounded. However, Rashi sternly asked Ugga why he wouldn't just go on and defeat the great ape himself. He realized that though he was the weakest member of his former party, he was still a mid-rank fighter, and since Rashi didn't take no for an answer, he let her draft the letter to the neighboring town and notify his hand-picked members at once. Some days later, they had arrived at the neighboring city of Ugga, and the city's lord welcomed him. They discussed building steamships, which the land of Ugga could not do, even though they wanted to, because their land was deficient in magic ore, which could power magic locomotives. The next day, Ugga and his troops ventured into the woods, and the representative of the Ugga kingdom couldn't help but comment on how the troops seemed to be in peak condition. Soon, Ugga addressed them, saying that if they ever saw the giant ape, they should not engage it but instead notify him. But if they were medium apes, they could work together and deal with them. Strong-headed goats like Yamasaki claimed they were strong and could even deal with the boss, even though his friend reminded him that the last time he said it, he was rendered semi-conscious. Right when they were talking, the apes ambushed them, and they thought it was the giant apes. But Ugga told them to calm down because those were only the medium apes. The adventurers were in a frenzy, but he told them all to calm down, even though they had been suddenly attacked. Bandu, the rep of the Ugga kingdom, shared that within a few days, it seemed the apes had significantly expanded their territory. There were only 8 apes, but they were now dispersed because the adventurers were running in all directions. Thus, Ugga told them to calm down and observe the situation, so they did, and noticed that 9 of them at a time surrounded one ape. Ugga then told them they were 75 in number and could go against the 8 apes, so there was no reason to panic because they were strong enough to overpower them. This little pep talk boosted their morale, and everyone worked tirelessly and in concert with one another to defeat the apes. The first one was down, and it was encouraging for Ugga, who decided to turn away from them. But just then, his horse stopped moving, and he realized that it was because the boss ape was right there in the woods with him. Ever since the apes gained control over the land of Ugga, 3 villages had been attacked and had victims numbering over 1,000. The giant ape was built like a mountain and had arms that could fly with the force of a flood. There was also a mysterious white-hot beam of light emanating from its mouth, which burned countless soldiers to ash. Right then and right now, that monster was there with them, directly facing Ugga. Poor Horsey knew it wasn't getting paid enough for all that, so it fled and left Ugga behind, attracting the attention of the giant ape towards the adventurers. Immediately, Ugga used his acceleration magic to attract the giant ape's attention, but was surprised to see the ape just sit on the floor, acting as though it was meditating. When everyone least expected it, the ape formed one of its laser beams and was about to torch the adventurers when Ugga immediately activated a white barrier to protect the adventurers. However, even though no one among the adventurers was hurt, Ugga's left arm took the fall for them. He suddenly felt disappointed in himself because he knew his former teammate Cross wouldn't screw up like that, and none of them would even take as much as a scratch from the great ape. This made him feel like a weakling, while Bando advised the adventurers to retreat for that day and leave to fight another day, because even though the people of Tokumo had done well, they were only on a fast track to repeat the mistakes Ugga had made. However, Rashi walked amongst their midst and said she didn't believe they had to retreat at all because she believed in Ugga. This also happened at the same time when the giant ape landed a punch that supposedly smashed Ugga into the ground. However, while everyone thought their lord was done for, Ugga made it out and was determined to prove himself even though he was just a mid-rank adventurer. He activated a fire spell that engulfed the giant ape's hands and face, but that wasn't enough to keep the beast down. At about the same time, Ugga moved straight for its head and stabbed him right in the middle of the forehead, thrusting his sword all the way through and securing victory. He felt he looked lame doing that and wanted to recover his stees, only to turn and find the adventurers all bowing to him as they realized they had all underestimated him. Later that evening, the Lord of Ugga threw a celebration for them, and they feasted while Rashi and Garcia drew up contracts for future financial dealings with the Lord. All of Ugga's hand-picked members grew even more substantially, and the monsters in Ugga dropped a good deal more experience than the ones in Ugga's territory. However, with his own blessed performance skill, all the experience from the big boss and mid-bosses was doubled. Particularly, Chiyo's fighting strength significantly skyrocketed, and the others weren't falling behind either. When it came to new magic, they were doing well. The archers had grown more accurate and could fire even at longer ranges. Substantially, everyone had grown. Ugga knew it was soon time for them all to outrank him, who was just at mid-rank, but his thoughts were interrupted by the Lord of Ugga, who thanked him for helping out and joined him to celebrate. The next day, they returned to Tokumo and were warmly received by the priest, who assured them of the completed construction of his mansion. The whole house was screaming luxury, and there was a bath with an ocean view, which Rashi planned to take advantage of to sleep. Meanwhile, Garcia handed him a letter from Ugga regarding ships, saying they were going to provide Tokumo with 350 passenger boats and a crew to use at the outset. That would only happen in a few months, and Ugga was equally anticipating the time for harvest, so he knew he had quite a lot on his plate beyond just fighting. On the other hand, this lady was approaching his mansion, whom he had yet to see. The next day, Ugga took Shuhei to the creepy cave that old lady Natty had pointed out to them and asked Shuhei for his opinion. They found hoof marks, but Shuhei advised that they were both amateurs and it wouldn't be wise for them to try anything to avoid risking collapse. In fact, the only advice he had for both of them was to get out of there quickly. But right after he said that, eerie laughter came out of the cave, and they immediately dashed off for their lives. They returned home to his stranger visitor, who introduced herself as Christia and was there to interview him. She got to inspecting him and seemed to know way too much about him, because she was a sucker for losers. It appeared she was someone who cared more about rising mid-tier adventurers than famous high-level people, and had been a fan of their party for about 5 years until they started becoming famous. She excitedly stated that she felt his training skills were wonderful, and especially after seeing what he did with his former party, she could tell that it was only his long-time vision that let him do that, not to mention that his training was filled with love. Even though she praised him in that manner and he was feeling fly, Ugga still stated that his skills were not able to keep him at the same pace as the rest of his party members. But Christia attacked him, saying that if it weren't for him, the hero's party would never have made it into the top 10 ranking, and that he deserved more praise and admiration than everyone. In all of this, Rashi was getting fed up with that dog's wife and told Ugga about his next appointment for the day. However, Christia stepped in and assumed his favorite position so he would allow her to follow him on his business. He asked her why she was so interested and whether the territory was already famous, but she said, unfortunately, it wasn't the case, even though she was pretty confident that the territory was about to become more famous after her interview with him. She followed him to the Western Forest, where his adventurers were in training, and he told her about his initial process of hand-picking them, and the plan to create 6 cohesive units, and then group up into a single 150-man force. She decided to jot things down, and Ugga realized that if the territory was to take on quests from the guild as a whole, then they would need the public to recognize that an entire territory could become a party. However, if they showed up at the guild without gaining public recognition, then the guild would shut its doors to them. But if word got out first and people's confidence had been increased, then the guild wouldn't be able to ignore them. This proved that even an article as small as what Christia was writing would be big for his territory. He later showed her around the territory and explained more about his plans for it. Eventually, the day came to an end, and he told her to head back to the mansion because he planned to meet the chief priest in Yamamura, even though he hadn't really met anyone living there. She insisted on accompanying him because there was one more thing she was yet to understand, even after all his interviews, which was whether the land of Tokumo really was as great a country as Ugga believed it was. The look on Ugga's face showed he wasn't thrilled by the question, but she asked him to pardon her rudeness, although she had to point it out. She admitted that his training skills had completely transformed the rural eastern nation, but it was entirely possible that the same thing could happen to other nations if he were there to leverage his talents, and so she was confused why he chose Tokumo of all places. And as such, because she was a reporter, she would stick around with him to see his reasons for herself. With that, they both headed to Yamamura, and on the way, Ugga admitted to himself that he had his own doubts, but even more than a simple desire to believe his skills were his belief that there was something bigger in Tokumo than the eyes could see. They eventually arrived at the northern region, Yamamura, and the priest shared with them that even though it used to be a quite prosperous nation, there was a gradual population decline. It was surprising that the land of Yamamura ever even flourished because it was rocky and had no village chief, with only 4 households. He used the Eye of God, the goddess, and found 2 mages and a vanguard fencer among the families, and they eventually arrived at the biggest household. The mother of the house enthusiastically welcomed them and asked them for a favor, saying they should take her useless, lazy younger brother, who would rather chew his hairy meatballs than say hi to a girl. His destined job was a miner, so he wasn't suited for combat, and Ugga didn't know how to break it to her. In any case, the lady of the house invited them to have dinner with them and stay for the night, and Christia urged Ugga to accept the invitation because the kids were growing on her. They eventually had dinner with the family, and Ugga understood that Akira was socially awkward. Hence, he couldn't work well with the other villagers. But even for someone who was such a lazy guy, he was quite buff. Also, Christia acknowledged that the village was wealthier than she had expected, and this was because they noticed some of the houses were large and fancy, and even the food and clothing spoke to a high degree of wealth. He asked the woman what most people did for a living, and she said they mediated between mountain hunters and other villagers, buying the prey that was hunted and processing meat to sell it to the other villagers. Kristja asked about the past of the village, during which they said there were many more people, but the lady said the village was doing a lot of things to survive and couldn't depend only on their wealth. However, something felt strange, and Ugga couldn't quite place a finger on it. Later that night, he noticed Akira moving and asked the lady of the house where exactly Akira was going. She said that her brother was going to dig more holes and had just been digging like an idiot, almost as though he could make any dime from it. Curious, Ugga decided to follow him and crept up behind him to find Akira digging through rocks endlessly and with various weapons. It seemed the guy was using different tools to ascertain the hardness of the rock, and even as he did what he did, Ugga could tell that he was a professional. However, the unfortunate thing was, no matter how good Akira was at what he was doing, if no one needed it, then he was worthless. Unfortunately, even his family thought of him as a worthless, lazy man, and he had no real place even among his own blood, just like Ugga among his party members. Ugga approached him and suggested that he take a quick break, but Akira soon became jittery and begged Ugga to forgive him and not harm him. However, Ugga pointed out how poor he was at socializing and offered him a cigarette. The guy settled and they discussed at length, during which Akira admitted it had been a long time since he had talked to anyone at all. With a bit of expired grape juice, Akira loosened up, reduced the stuttering, and they had established an excellent rapport. Then Akira became confident and asked Ugga about the questions he had asked about the village's past, and then shared that he once heard his grandfather say what had made Yamamura a prosperous village. He took him then to some groves, which were very similar to the Western Cave. It turned out their people used to be miners, but the minerals were exhausted, and villagers started decreasing in number. So Akira actually learned a few mining skills from his dad, and brought out some rocks that his granddad had left for him after he taught him how to dig. Instantly and out of the blue, Kristja screamed that what was in his hands was magic ore. She had followed him because of her reporter's intuition, but the main issue right now was that they had discovered magic ore. Thereafter, he took Akira to the Western Cave, and Akira said that it was also a mine, but it was in the process of being mined, and there was a high chance of minerals being found there. They were all jubilant, and Ugga said that from that month onward, Akira would be working for him. He extended his hand to establish their deal, and Akira accepted it with tears in his eyes. Kristja was eager to share, but he asked her not to, because they hadn't officially started mining, and if word got out, other countries might take the chance to invade them. But he assured her that if she would be pleased to, she could be exclusively writing about his territory from that day onward. And as she looked into his passionate eyes that had always made her admire him, she accepted his offer, promising to write an excellent article about the territory. Also, she handed him the last issue of the Adventurer magazine, in which Ugga discovered that Cross's party was still in 9th place. Kristja felt that was their reward for firing Ugga, and told him their party wasn't progressing because their star, Mori, had been missing. Speaking of Cross's party, they were in a certain desert on a quest against high-level monsters, particularly S-ranked lizard men. Cross and Dari struggled and defeated them as a team, while Emma and Tianan urged them to fight well because no matter the depth of injury, they would help heal them. However, Emma acknowledged that if Mori were present and had used his single magic explosion, the monsters would be neatly dealt with. Tiana warned her to remain focused because there were only 4 of them and encouraged them all, saying Mori would return to us, and he was very confident about that. A few days later, in the metropolis of Zahul Belt, the holy land of adventurers, they were warmly welcomed by their fangirls, but Dari just didn't want to have to face those obsessed girls, and thought he could make the girls have his babies with just a handshake. And with Mori's sudden disappearance, and him being their star performer, the guild wouldn't let their team go on any arc-themed rank quests anytime soon. They felt stupid because after going through so much trouble to arrive at the holy land of adventurers, they got nothing in return, and nothing was interesting for them to do. Just then, they were flooded by reporters who asked them to share more about Mori's disappearance and why Cross and Tiana were trying to cover it up. These particular people who had ambushed Emma and Dari were 100 times worse than the fangirls he had to avoid. But Dari remembered Tiana's advice to not offend the reporters by keeping silent to avoid trouble. They kept bugging them with more questions, and Dari only wished Emma was there to help him through it all, but the girl had disappeared into the lounge to take tea. She noticed that Tiana wasn't in her best mood, so she planned to prank her, but Dari caught her just in time and told her to stay quiet. Later, Cross approached Tiana and asked her how it went with the guild, but she reported that they wouldn't let them take on high-ranking quests anymore. Unfortunately, even though they had finished a lot of A-rank quests, they had been in 9th place for a few months. It turns out the highest-ranked quests were usually reserved for the top 7 adventurer parties, so the guild couldn't break the rules and assign such quests to the 9th party, and if they wanted to ascend any higher, they would need all 5 of their so-called Fantastic Five. Particularly, Mori, who was widely known and accepted among adventure critics, was valuable to them because, at such a young age, he had mastered 2 of the 6 magical attributes to the highest level. Mori's absence alone raised considerable doubt among critics worldwide. The party members couldn't deny this because their fighting strength had noticeably diminished ever since Mori left. The truth was that Mori found out that Ugga had been sent away and became furious, no matter how they tried to spin it. He called them selfish and refused to reason with them while running off on his own. It was then that Cross realized that he had made a mistake sending Ugga away, but Tiana told him to stop saying that because it was true from an objective point of view that Ugga could no longer keep up with their party. He advised that it was not Cross's fault, and neither was it Ugga's, so perhaps the fun times in their party had come to an end. Dari and Emma were still eavesdropping, so he advised that they should go to school, but Emma told him that they should still hold on. Cross at that time asked Tiana whether she had considered his proposal for them to start dating officially, but she immediately became flushed and said they were in a very critical time period, so they had to keep adventuring as their priority for the time being. The poor guy sighed and said she was right that it wasn't a good time, but he would be patient and wait for a good answer. He bade her goodbye, and Emma watched with sympathy for Cross, who couldn't just understand that Tiana couldn't let go of Ugga and start dating him. While Emma felt it was typical for ladies to prefer being with their second loves, Dari said no one would be happier with anyone other than the one they loved the most. The question was why Tiana didn't just go ahead with Ugga, but Dari explained that Ugga broke up with her because he knew he wouldn't be able to keep up with their party. This only revealed that Tiana was just hopeless and had used the retirement money as a cover, hoping that Ugga would take her with him. However, Ugga wouldn't have noticed this if she hadn't come out directly to tell him. However, Dari looked at Emma, yapping and acting as if she herself was not madly in love with Ugga. Meanwhile, at Tokumo, Ugga was packing for a vacation because harvest season was at hand, and he had been advised to have a vacation by Garcia. Garcia instantly knew that he was going out to look for Mori, so they supported him and asked him to be back at least by the Autumn Harvest Festival. He smiled to himself while on the boat after realizing that Mori left the party because he was fired, and if so, then the reason he was on the team was just to keep Mori there. His memory traveled to the day Mori visited them as a girl, saying she wanted to be a man. At the time, the party was composed of only Ugga, Tiana, and Cross, and Mori had enthusiastically asked them to turn him into the number 1 ranked adventurer in the whole world. Ugga wondered why a girl like her wanted to become a man, so Mori said she just wanted to be powerful because women were weaker than men. However, Ugga said it wasn't so, but when he used the goddess eye on Mori and found out that her latent job was to become a combat wizard, he saw the potential for her to master every magical attribute up to level 5. With that, he welcomed her on board and told her he was pretty sure she could make it all the way to number 1. Tiana wasn't in support of that because of Mori's age at the time, but Ugga said that Mori was the girl who would cause their party to succeed, and he would personally take full responsibility for her training. He and Tiana went back and forth about her, but Mori begged them not to fight, and Cross came in between them, telling them he was confident in what Ugga had said about Mori. In no time, Mori's lessons began with Ugga, and she eventually leveled up to the point where she could use high levels of magic. In the present day, Ugga had just searched Mori's hometown for her and scoured all the regions where their adventurers as a party had taken them. but he couldn't find any trace of her. It was pretty cold that night and he had to head back to his territory, but he first stopped at the port town of a certain town, ordered for some furniture for his mansion, and then boarded a ship. He found that there was a new issue of the Adventurer magazine and purchased it, and then he saw Christia's story about the fantastic things he was doing with his new territory. He arrived at Tsukuhama, and the lady from the Yellow Crane Tower recognized him, saying her girls missed him so much. When she noticed his mood was downcast, she urged him to stay the night, but he told her he couldn't because he had just spent all his money on furniture. He tried his best to avoid her charms, to overcome her charms, but failed to and eventually got another ticket. Soon, he was back home and thanked Garcia and Rashi for helping him look after the place while he was away. They informed him that Akira had transformed the mining to a whole other level, so he dug out a new route to the mountain instead of digging the existing cave. Essentially, he was having fun while working, and this made Ugga happy for him. Rashi walked over to him, took off his coat and asked him if he wanted to have her for dinner, but he chose instead to have a bath. However, when she saw that he had visited the Yellow Crane Tower, she soon started boiling from within. Meanwhile, Ugga enjoyed a nice bath while hoping Mori was staying warm and wondering what he would have done instead. He got emotional because he missed the girl and instead just enjoyed the sunset. However, from above, Fantani suddenly appeared and slipped her hands beneath her plot armor, almost scarring Ugga for life. However, it turned out she was only keeping a magazine there, in which she had noticed an article about him on the next page. She said she now understood why he turned her down for certain plans, because the plans were written in that article. Even though she used that opportunity to get in beside him, he tried to push her out, but she had her own way and enjoyed a bath with him. She also started making fun of his muscles and then thanked him for keeping her company as a muscle buddy. While he got dressed, Rashi showed up in the bath, saying he had a guest waiting for him. But the moment she saw Fantani there, and that Fantani was all alone with her Ugga, she was only one bullet away from becoming a murderer. Apparently, the guest was a stranger, and when Ugga went to receive the guest, it turned out to be none other than Mori. It turned out that just as Fantani had found him through the article, Mori had similarly located him after reading about him in the article. He was excited and patted her on the head, glad that she had returned safely. But just then, Fantani came in again through the door like she hadn't been bent over in the bathroom for Ugga. Both her and Mori recognized each other. Fantani referred to Mori as a lad, but everyone was just confused, wondering how she saw a boy in Mori. Some days later, Mori and Fantoni had both comfortably settled into the environment in Ugga's territory, because Ugga didn't want Mori to run off on her own again. Later, Ugga was told that he had a magic gram, which was a means of communication that let one send a few letters of a message to a distant land. But surprisingly, all the letter read was that the sender was coming to meet Ugga. It was the season for the Autumn Harvest Festival, and the day before the festival, Fantani called Ugga, and he wondered if she was trying to get him to exercise with her. However, she told him it was time for her to return to her adventure. But with the sad expression on her face, he wondered if she wanted him to stop her because of how she hesitated. However, he urged her to do so and told her the world wouldn't be kind enough to reserve the #1 spot for her if all she did was chill day after day. However, she stated that she had a favor to ask of him, which was that Mori should accompany her. Ugga already felt that Fantani would request this, but she continued saying that since she was the top-ranked adventurer in the world, she would ensure that Mori attained more high-level quests, and in the future probably would end up as his bride. Now Ugga knew Fantani was a creep, but didn't know she was a creep to that extent. So he simply said that if Mori was interested in working with Fantani, he had no intention to get in the way. But it would be quite difficult because their positions overlapped. For one, Fantani was an elite and untouchable swordswoman, and could excel in both offensive magic and physical swordsmanship while dealing with enemies as well as the boss beasts. But that already included the role of a combat wizard like Mori, and made her own role redundant. The #1 adventurer said that maybe combining both their powers would speed things up. But Ugga informed her that the gap between their abilities was way too wide for that to happen, and she was still stronger than Mori. So Mori would have to fully develop her abilities before getting to Fantani's level. No matter how many high-level quests they both went on, Mori wouldn't be able to get the necessary real-world experience from working with Fantani, so it was unlikely for Mori to accept this proposal. And even though Fantani cared deeply about Mori, she just had to know the truth. Ugga had not yet exposed Mori's true identity when Fantani got upset and said she needed some time to herself. He realized that, despite her being the #1 in the world, she couldn't have everything she dreamed of and was still sad in her heart. But still, he was no different from her and simply was reminded about that by looking at the magic gram he got. The day of the Harvest Festival arrived, and Fantani and the girls were both filled with excitement, especially Mori, for whom it was the first time participating in the activity. In the shrine, the villagers were all asking Ugga whether he had completely defeated some of the monsters as he promised in his bulletins, but Ugga stuttered because he couldn't give them the response they were looking for. However, Garcia spoke up for him, saying the monster population in the west had dramatically reduced while the village's forces had only strengthened, as evidenced by defeating the great ape that had been burning Ugga down. Thereafter, he gave Ugga his cue to speak, and Ugga shared a prime feature in the magazine published around the world, which showed that their territory had attracted the eyes of the world. He also said that once they registered with the Adventurers Guild and started taking on quests, the very name of their nation would rock the world. This motivated everyone that night, and their voices could be heard from the stars. Later that night, Ugga went out for a smoke and saw Mori entertaining the village kids with her magic. As he saw the magic orb, he remembered that that was the very first spell he ever taught her. Back then, she was still a noob, but was not scared of being possessed by his spirit at all, and she even pestered him, asking him to teach her more spells every day. Watching her rapid growth was incredible, and he personally studied all through the night so he could have more things to teach her. As Mori evolved into a woman, the girl who had been claiming she wanted to be a man was gone, and literally, Ugga had taught her everything there had to be taught. One day, she asked him if they could do more spells, but he couldn't say no to her, and he took her back to the basics to learn magic control. Still, Mori was excited to learn even the basics from him, even though she knew everything there had to be taught in magic. As Ugga was lost in thought, Mori rushed to hug him and showed him a bamboo copter that the neighboring friends had given her. He simply positioned it or made it fly, teaching her a lesson that letting things go at the right time could make one soar higher than their imagination. During the festival, Fantani bullied Ugga's adventurers into some muscle training, and Ugga told Mori they needed to talk. But before he could utter a word, she told him she was not going back and was staying in his territory because he was there and there was still so much for him to teach her. However, he told her that even she knew there was nothing more he could teach her, and was only feeling sorry for him by refusing to stay with the party that fired him. However, she said it wasn't the case, and that he had so much kindness that she couldn't stop appreciating it. Ugga told her that if she still planned to be #1, then she would have to stay with the party because the only way she could keep growing was with the right team and by gaining practical combat experience. Mori asked him to return to the party with her, but he told her he no longer had a place there, and that was why he was fired in the first place. He shared that he was now doing what he enjoyed doing, just like old times, and she no longer had to pity him anymore. However, Mori angrily burst out and said that what he thought the situation was not it at all. This was the first time he ever saw her react in such a manner, so he asked her to tell him what the problem was, but Mori could only blush and couldn't bring herself to say a word. Eventually, they returned home, and on the way back, she stated that she was pretty sure the other party members were mad at her for leaving without letting them know. However, that made him realize how guilty she felt about the whole thing, and so he told her that everything would be fine as long as she apologized. Surprisingly, though, Mori saw Tiana, who hugged the girl tight, saying she was sorry that they had kept quiet about Ugga. Mori then revealed a secret from her. As they both cried in each other's arms, Ugga returned to his mansion and asked for a bath. While he waited for Tiana and Mori to finish bathing, Fantani returned soaking wet after dealing with those boys in his party. He sent her in to take a shower, but she soon stepped out of the bathroom, screaming that Mori, who was a boy, had now become a lady. How will Fantani survive knowing that her knight in shining armor was, in fact, a girl? And will Tiana ever want to return to Cross's party now that she's reunited with Ugga, her true love. Finally, can Ugga's party overtake his ex-party and rise to the top? If you'd like to see how it all plays out in Part 2, type Playboy Mansion in the comment section. If you enjoyed the video, give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for similar content. As always, thanks for watching.